The one I want to tell you now is the story of the lady in the gray taffeta dress. Are you familiar with that story, kids? Mm-hmm. Well, I think it'd be more interesting to tell it here in this house because it is in this town, you know, that it happened. This town of East Columbia was the setting for the story of the lady in the gray taffeta dress. Now, East Columbia is one of the oldest Anglo-American towns in Texas. It was founded in 1823 by a man named Josiah H. Bell. He called it Marion, but the colonists didn't take to that, and they immediately dubbed it Bell's Landing, and it was known by that name for many years. Well, during the days of the Republic, it was a busy river port. Now, you all have been seeing the Brazos River right out here, haven't you? Well, it was up the Brazos River that these steamboats came, flat-bottom steamboats, and they had stern wheels, wheels on the side, and wheels on the back, and they brought in things that the colonists needed, and they docked up here just a little ways. And they took on rich cargoes of cotton and syrup and sugar from the surrounding plantations. And if you can believe it, try to imagine this town like it was then. It had a business district right along the river up here. It was called Front Street. There were a lot of buildings along there. Of course, they were frame buildings, most of them. Some of them were brick. And they had a meat market. They had they even had a jewelry store. They had several general stores, and they had a hotel. Oh, it was a busy place. The merchants did a whole lot of business, you know, the people that had the stores, and everything was just going great guns. But all that's gone now. And gone, too, is a house that stood, now think of yourself, it's gone way up the river about a mile. Well, this house stood above the business district, and it faced the river. And folks called it the Swinney House. And it was as haunted as all get out. When I was growing up, it had been haunted as long back as anybody else could remember, and was still haunted. It was still there then. I don't know. The reason it's haunted was because of a murder that took place there. That was even before the Swinneys owned it. I don't know how old the house was. I don't know who built it. But it was standing empty once many, many years ago when a man and his wife came to town. Now the husband went into some kind of business, I don't know what kind, opened some kind of business, and they needed a place to stay, and they looked around and found this vacant house, and they bought it, and they moved in. Well, as soon as the ladies in the town, probably some of them that lived in this house even, and as soon as they heard there was a new family in town, they decided they would go and call on these new people and welcome them, you know, tell them we were glad they came, and invite them to church and that sort of thing. They might have been a little bit curious, you know, a little bit nosy, but also they were friendly, and that was custom in those days. So a group of them got together one afternoon, and they went to the house, and they knocked on the door. Well, the man came, opened the door, and oh, he was so nice and so friendly and so pleased when he learned why they had come. He said his wife would just be delighted to see them, that she was so lonesome and she didn't know a soul, and this was so nice of them. And he ushered them into the living room, and there they got their first glimpse of the lady in the gray taffeta dress. She was standing over by the window, and she was tall and very slender. Her hair was black, and she wore it parted in the middle and pulled down like this over her ears and in a knot low on her neck. Her face was very pale. She wore a long gray taffeta dress, which was belted in at the waist with a narrow, almost tube-like sash. The sash probably was not quite as big as my little finger. Now keep that sash in mind because it plays an important part in the story. Well, if she was glad to see the ladies, she didn't show it. She was polite, but she wasn't very friendly. She didn't have anything to say for herself, or she would answer their questions. Then, you know, that finally got pretty tiresome. So after a short, rather uncomfortable visit, they left. But they went away saying what a shame it was that a nice man like that had such an unfriendly, standoffish wife. But they thought, well, maybe she's just shy and reserved, and maybe she'll warm up to us when she knows us better. So they decided they'd go back, and they did. They went back several times. But she didn't ever warm up to them. She remained as aloof, as cool as ever. She never came to church. She never returned their calls. And finally, they just quit going to see her. You know, they got the message. She just didn't care. But every now and then, they'd see her maybe in the store or walking aimlessly along the dusty street, and they noticed a strange thing. She always wore the same dress. Or if it wasn't the same dress, she had a number of dresses made of the same material and cut to the same pattern. She always wore a long gray taffeta dress that rustled gently when she walked. One day a man came to town, and he had business with the husband, and there was no hotel at the moment, and so he was invited to spend the night with the couple. This was customary too. If you had business with a man, they usually invite you to spend the night. And the next day he told around town, he said, "I think that woman's kind of off her rocker." And he said, she moved around all night. She said, I could hear her downstairs. I thought maybe something was wrong. And he said, I got up and I leaned over the banister and I could see her. And he said, she was going from window to window, and she was trying the locks on the windows, clicking them off and on. And when she come to a door, she'd slide the bolt on the door and slide it back. She was making sure that everything was locked up tight, see? And he said, I don't think she ever undressed either, because the rest of the night, every time I woke up, I could hear the rustle of a skirt down the stairs, punctuated by the clicking on and off of the locks and the sliding of the bolts. Well, finally one day, sometime had passed, the ladies were surprised to learn that the house was up for sale and the couple was going to move away. So now they felt kind of guilty. Maybe they hadn't tried hard enough. Obviously, she was nervous and afraid in this still rather wild country, you know, and maybe they should have gone to see her more and tried to make her feel more at home. So now they felt that the only thing they could do was go and tell them goodbye and wish them well. So they went to the door again, same group, knocked on the door as before, and as before, the man opened it. Well, he was still smiling, still friendly, still glad to see him. But now he was quite surprised that they didn't know that his wife had already left town. He said that she was so nervous and so upset all the time, he was afraid she was headed for a real breakdown, and he had sent her back home to her folks in the East, and he was going to join her as soon as he could sell the house and wind up his business. Well, the ladies were sure surprised that anybody could leave town bagging baggage, you know, without their knowing about it. But they didn't doubt his word. Who would, a nice man like that? The next week, the man was able to finish his business and sell the house, and departed for parts unknown. He left. The people who bought the house were named, the man who bought the house was named Thomas Jefferson Swinney, and his wife was named Elizabeth. And after they bought the house, they had everything cleaned out real good, because that's what you do when you move into a house where somebody else has been living. And one of the things they did was have the cistern cleaned out. Well, when they had their cistern cleaned out, the men who came to do it made a grisly discovery. Do you know what grisly means? Something pretty awful. You know what they found? Floating around in that water? Oh, you do, don't you? The body of the lady in the gray taffeta dress. And she was dead as a doornail. She had been strangled. Do you remember that belt I told you about? Mm-hmm. That narrow belt? You remember it was around her waist? Well, it wasn't around her waist anymore. It was around her neck. Deeply embedded in the flesh. And she was dead, as I said. Well, everybody knew who done her in, you know what I mean? It had to be her husband. He had lied. He had said he sent her back to her folks, and there was no doubt that he was the one who did it. But there wasn't anything that they could do about it. They didn't know where he went. So they did the only thing they could. They removed the body and gave it Christian burial. And the Swinneys had the system cleaned out extra good, you know. And then they moved in. Well, nothing happened, and many months had passed when the Swinneys' little niece, whose name was Musetta, came to live with them. Now, Musetta lived with her family out on a plantation near the town of Swinney and Old Ocean over there. And they didn't have any schools. They used to have tutors come and teach the children, you know. But East Columbia had a school, and they thought it would be a fine idea for her to come and stay with her aunt and uncle and take advantage of the school. It was supposed to be a pretty good one. But do you know that from the minute she entered that house, she was scared to death of it? She didn't know why. Nobody had told her about the murder. Nobody would tell a kid, she's about 10 years old, a thing like that. And anyway, it had been, oh, say, nearly a year, and they had all but forgotten about it. But she was scared of that house. And she had no idea why it frightened her, so she didn't tell anybody. She was ashamed of it. She's a pretty big kid, as I said. Well, but when she'd come home from school in the afternoon, she would open the door and stand there holding it open, call out to her aunt, and if nobody was home, she would go back outside and play if the weather was nice, or go to her neighbors if the weather was bad. But under no circumstances would she stay in that house for 1 minute by herself. Well, one afternoon, it was in December, almost Christmas, and it was a dark, dreary kind of a day, raining a little bit, and it was cold. It almost seemed if it got a little colder, it might snow. Well, she came home from school as usual, and she pulled open the door, and she stood there, and she called out, "Auntie?" And there was no answer. So she called again, "Auntie?" Still no answer. So she just about to turn and go back outside when she heard something upstairs. It sounded like footsteps and the rustle of a skirt. And she thought with relief, oh, Auntie is home after all. And she let that heavy door fall to behind her. Well, that was where she made a mistake. Now, that hall was not very bright on the best of days, and it was pretty dusky on this day. There was one window up above the landing. The steps, you see how the steps did in that house, not like they do in this one. They went straight up a ways, then there was a landing, like a platform, and then they went up again until they got upstairs. Well, over this landing there was a window, but it had purple glass in it, and that certainly didn't do much to dispel the gloom. Suddenly she saw, standing on that landing, the figure of a woman. Now, Musetta wasn't a shy child. She wouldn't have been afraid to welcome any guest in the house, even one who was a stranger to her. But she, not such a one as this. She knew immediately this was not a creature of flesh and blood, and she turned cold to her very bones. Now, slowly, the ghostly woman started down the stairs. She was holding out her arms like this, and she was smiling, but it was a mean smile, a smile of infinite evil. Her fingers were tipped with long, pointed fingernails, and her lips, curved in that wicked smile, were as red as the yopon berries that grow on the little trees along the road and in the woods, and her face was as pale as death. Slowly, one step at a time, the ghostly woman came down the steps, her skirt rustling as she moved, and Musetta stood there, absolutely unable to move, paralyzed with fear. Finally, the woman came to the bottom step, was reaching out her arms to embrace the child, when Musetta made one last desperate effort, pulled open the door, and ran outside. And then she did an incredible thing. She walked all the way to her home, plantation home, a distance of some 10 miles through the wintry night. She never set foot in that house again. Now, there's another story about a young man that spent the night in that house. He was a local fella. He lived here in town. His name was Charlie Bennett. And I don't think there was any money involved this time. He just made his brags and boasted, you know, that he'd spend the night there. Well, when night came, he wasn't so cocky and sure of himself. He was a little sorry he had boasted so much, because he was kind of scared. But he went on in anyway. Nothing he could do by that time. And they sat down out in the road. There was no traffic, of course, and watched to make sure that he spent the entire night there. Well, he was in there for about 2 hours, and they were waiting and watching, and they almost stopped talking, dozing, when suddenly one of the boys said, "Look up there." And they looked. And there, in an upstairs window looking out, they saw the face of Charlie Bennett, and his mouth was open in a soundless scream. Well, while they watched, too terrified to do anything, didn't know what to do anyway, Charlie Bennett came through that window and was deposited gently on the grass by a nebulous figure. That means a sort of a shapeless figure, all white and shining in the moonlight. You believe that story? You don't believe it? My aunt told me that story. And my aunt lived right here in this house. She was the last one to live here. She may come back and haunt you if you say you don't believe her. She didn't see it, but these young men told her about it, so of course you don't know whether it's true or not, do you? Well, anyway, now the last thing about the Swinney house is that one night, a man and a woman, Mr. and Mrs. Duff, Mr. and Mrs. Ned Duff, were coming back from church, and they waylaid past the Swinney house. By this time, the Swinneys had decided that they had better lock the house up, and they had secured it very firmly. They put boards across the doors and the windows, you know, even the padlock on the front gate. She and her husband were walking down the road when suddenly they saw in front of them a couple of figures, a man and a woman, all dressed in white. So she said, "Ned, who are those people? I don't remember anybody that looked like that in church, dressed that way." And he said, "Well, I don't know who they are." And she said, "Well, let's catch up with them and see. Maybe there's some new people in town." But it didn't do any good, because as fast as they walked, the couple in front quickened their pace too and walked even faster. And they couldn't gain an inch on them. So finally the couple in white got in front of the Swinney house and stopped. Well, the Duff stopped too, because Miss Duff was so shocked. She said, "They can't have moved in that house. I noticed it when we came by a few hours ago." And she said, "It's locked up tighter than a drum. It's nailed up. There's no way anybody could have moved in that house." But you see, that didn't bother the couple in white. They walked right through the fence and right through the wall. Now, I don't know, of course, you know, that white could have been gray, don't you think? It could have just looked white in the moonlight. I was just wondering if perhaps the lady in the gray taffeta dress had become reconciled with her husband, you know, gotten back together with him again on the other side. I hope not, don't you? After what he did to her. Maybe she got her another beau. That's what I like to think. Because that had to be who that was, you know. Now, that house is gone now, of course. There's not anything left of it then. It's pretty grown up around there. But there are those who say that they have seen on dark nights, particularly when there's a ground fog, something we have sometime, you know, the figure of a woman moving about the area. And they say, too, that she follows a definite pattern. She raises one graceful arm like this and makes this kind of a motion. Then she moves along a little further, does the same thing. And at longer intervals, she'll reach out and make a sliding motion. And those who have seen this believe, or say they believe, that it's the ghost of the lady in the gray taffeta dress, still trying the long gone doors and windows, still attempting to shut out the evil that all the time was in the house itself.